Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining our meeting. We might have some stragglers come in, but that's okay. And my name is Richard Moses. And for those of you who don't know, the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, we're a volunteer not-for-profit group formed in 2007, whose mission is the preservation of the historic Lower East Side, which includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. And we do this primarily through city landmarking, or trying to get buildings in historic districts landmarked. But we're also concerned about the local culture, that is a culture that's extended back 200 years and is very much alive today. So that's who we are. And I wanted to have a couple of shout outs to people in city government. I see Fanny up here from Grace Lee. Hi, Fanny. And Sandra Strother from CB3 Landmarks Committee. And I also want to give a shout out to Bill Neely from the Landmarks Commission, and Ann Friedman, who's not from city government, but who's from the Sacred Sites Program of the New York Landmarks Conservancy, who's been a big help to us with St. Mary's, which we're going to be talking about in a little while. And then, of course, there's the person who will be giving our first presentation tonight, which is Conor Allerton from City Councilmember Christopher Marte's office. And just a couple of housekeeping things. The meeting is being recorded, so we'll all try to be on our best behavior. And we expect to post it on our YouTube site. If you're going to eat your dinner or talk on the phone and gesture a lot, it's probably better to turn off your camera, because these things will be, immortalized for all time on YouTube. And we have some examples of that, which, if you're curious, you'll see on YouTube now. We're not really eager to repeat it. It's best to raise your hand if you want to speak. We will have discussion. The idea is it's not just presentation, but presentation and discussion tonight. And that, however, because we have a tight schedule, we really have only about an hour to talk about both City of Yes and St. Mary's. We may not be able to get to everybody's questions or comments, but we'll do our best, and I think it'll be a helpful format anyway. So I first want to introduce, as I mentioned before, Conor Allerton here tonight, and who's very graciously offered to present on City of Yes for housing opportunities. He's with New York. He's the director of land use at New York City Councilmember Christopher Marte's office, and Chris Marte has been a great friend of the neighborhood and of preservation in the neighborhood since taking office. So we're very lucky to have him and his staff kind of on our side here. So Conor, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name is Conor Allerton, as Richard mentioned, Director of Land Use for Councilmember Marte. And something that's been a big project for us recently has been City of Yes, which is I have some slides prepared. It's a very large overhaul of the zoning in 3 different applications proposed by Eric Adams and the administration. We've been doing it's a ton of changes and a ton of text, and it can be very dry and technical. So a lot of people don't maybe pay as much attention to it as they should. So we've been trying to change that, trying to get people involved at the community level, as well as everywhere from the community to the council. And so we're excited that you all are hosting or having me for this discussion. I tried to orient a bit toward preservation, but it covers so many different aspects of our city landscape that I just left a lot of other content in there too, just because I'm sure people are curious and how it, especially how it overlaps with maybe preservation and other issues. So I'm just going to share my screen and get started. And then I'll try to not to spend too much time on the presentation, just so we can also have some discussion if people are interested. So, let's see. Okay. Okay. Does that work? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, as I mentioned, this is the shoot, let me just see how I can hide some of these Zoom related things on my screen quickly. 1 second. Okay. As I mentioned, this is the mayor's plan to update zoning for New York. A lot of mayoral administrations have large overhauls of the zoning around a certain theme. This kind of touches on 3 different themes around 3 different actual applications, which are called text amendments. It sounds like what it is. It's you're changing the text of the zoning itself. Zoning at its heart is just code, like any other building code or housing code, local law. And every time you want to change it, you want to change the actual text itself, you have to go through the ULURP process, which stands for Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. We might all be familiar with various applications that have gone through ULURP. The biggest, hottest topic ones are usually neighborhood rezonings, which you've seen recently in Soho. There was one in Inwood a few years ago. There was one in the East Harlem, and yeah, there's some ones in the outer boroughs as well. So this is a text amendment or 3 text amendments. We're on the final 3rd one, housing opportunity, which I'm going to be focusing on today. Carbon neutrality was the first one. It was relatively inconsequential. It expanded and facilitated solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage, and electric vehicle charging across the city, or at least just put down some barriers to implementing those things, those clean energy infrastructure through zoning. Obviously, a bunch of other things have to be implemented to tackle carbon neutrality in the city, but that was just one aspect. There were a few complaints around where it's all going to go, how it's going to take over people's backyards and roof space, things like that. But more or less, it was relatively small compared to the following 2, which were definitely much more controversial. Economic opportunity, which passed the council in June 2024, dealt with business uses, mixed use zoning, so allowing businesses and residents in the same buildings and the same blocks and neighborhoods, which businesses can go where, that kind of thing. And we had a ton of issues with that at the outset, and we actually got a lot of changes, which I'll talk about briefly in the next slide. So we were actually happy with the amount of leverage we were able to put onto changing that application. That's what ULURP is for, right? It's supposed to change through ULURP, and so we're glad that the administration was flexible on a few key points. And we're hoping to see the same with housing opportunity, which is in front of us now. It's currently at the City Planning Commission level. It's already gone through the community boards and the borough presidents, which are the early stages of ULURP. And now, once it gets voted on this month by city planning, it'll head to the council. So, economic opportunity, like I mentioned, we got a lot of changes. Some ones that we highlighted here are, initially the proposal allowed for this much more flexibility in terms of which floors of a building can be commercial, which floors can be residential. And the goal, the stated goal there was to allow for more flexibility in expanding residential uses through mixed use buildings, but they didn't prevent residences from being converted into businesses by the owner of that building. So we were able to make that explicitly prohibited through this conversion process, which we were excited about. Home occupations are when you have a business out of your residential home, which is already allowed today, but under certain rules. They were expanding pretty drastically, those allowances, and we kind of reined it in a little bit more to what we see today. Reinstating a square footage cap on how much of your home can be used for business, as well as the business types, and sort of the general scope impact of a business in a residential unit, which is obviously surrounded by other residential units. We want to make sure that neighbors aren't unduly impacted by those businesses. And, when I say business, it's really more of just like we wanted to get at, like, we didn't want someone opening up a fish market in their apartment or something, or even like things like barbershop or things that are really client heavy. We wanted to make sure that the impact was as small as possible on their neighbors. Production and commercial overlays. A commercial overlay is when you have a residentially zoned district. A lot of our residentially zoned districts downtown are actually in the Lower East Side, on the far East Side, past like Essex Street, where you see it's mostly just residences. The reason that there's businesses on the ground floor of a lot of those buildings, especially on like Grand Street, for example, is because of commercial overlay. They just allow for businesses in a primarily residential district, but they were drastically expanding the kind of businesses that this could be. So we made sure to rein in that as well. And then finally, a big change was requiring council oversight on commercial uses on NYCHA campuses. A lot of NYCHA campuses are zoned residential only. Some are commercially, like we have Smith houses in our district. That's actually has a commercial overlay, like I mentioned. So that's why they have a supermarket. But a lot are just residential only. And so they wanted to make it a lot easier for just businesses to crop up in those complexes without a lot of oversight. And so we made sure that the council could have a vote on those businesses if it deemed necessary. So that was just a summary of sort of what we were able to accomplish and why we're kind of excited to be able to push for the changes we want to see in the next round, because we were relatively successful in the last round. Housing opportunity, it's really about building, like the goal here established by the administration is we want to ramp up our supply production of housing just across the board. And so the only way that you can really do that is to allow for more density in more places. They're calling it a little bit more housing everywhere. And so you're seeing basically new increases in allowed density in every neighborhood, in every district in the city. I think that one of our larger, maybe more existential kind of critiques is sort of what we mean when we say housing. Who is it for, right? What is it really supposed to provide? We really do want to think about housing as an essential good, not as a commodity. And of course, there needs to be a supply of housing, but we also want to get at the fact that we have so much housing currently that is incredibly unaffordable to the average New Yorker. We also have a ton of vacant units that are just not occupied by anybody. And so, also, if I just got a connection unstable message, so just please let me know if you stop being able to hear me. And so the way that they're talking about this is basically it's treating zoning like a inhibitor to production and trying to cut red tape and deregulate to the extent that they want to see the market really do what it does best and just build, and they argue that with that increase in supply, costs will go down. As we see, like, housing in New York is a very complex topic. You can't just treat it like supply and demand. Like, there's discrimination, there's speculation, there's all these other moving factors. There's vacancy. So that's a huge critique that I think we have of the overarching approach. Also, the fact that there was no proactive engagement of communities in devising the plan. As you might know, if you are familiar with rezoning, of neighborhood rezonings, they always have some sort of engagement program ahead of the actual proposal. That's usually years long. Like in Soho, even though that proposal ended up being really controversial, they did have at least they had a few years of engagement with the Soho community and all these different stakeholders to try to get at what the issues were that they were trying to address. There was none of that in this process. It's just, here you go. Here's 6 months to tell us what you think. So I think that's a big problem. And yeah, like I mentioned, this is a supply approach. And it's really not getting at some of the more powerful tools we have at our disposal, like mandated affordability, which I'll get into a little bit. And what they are doing as it relates to affordability is they're replacing what we have now, which is a voluntary inclusionary housing program. It's one of our two affordability programs that are in the zoning itself. We have mandatory and we have voluntary. And voluntary is has been around a lot longer than mandatory, actually, and it's an opt-in program in really specific districts where you can actually get a little bit more zoning bonus, like more floor area to build, a larger building envelope, in exchange for a percentage of those units being affordable, restricted at a certain income. That program, even though it's been around since the 80s, has actually not yielded overall that many units. And so what they're doing is they're proposing what's called universal affordability preference, which is a much more extensive optional affordability program to many more districts citywide. And so while this will definitely be a more impactful, it'll produce many more affordable units than the existing voluntary program. What comes with that is places that didn't have even the option to get that bonus now do. And so you're going to see the maximum, all-time maximum FAR that you can have in a district, FAR being the floor to area ratio, which is how you measure density. Basically, your maximum density in a lot of these districts is going to go up. That difference is going to be affordable, but it's important to mention that what used to only be a certain size building in a certain district can now be a little bit bigger citywide. And so, or at least Manhattan-wide. So this is like a really important sort of trade-off that's worth considering. I think it's not really the our biggest criticism of the plan, but it's important to say that they're basically trying to ramp up the ability for developers to opt into an affordability program, but with that comes the density. The density usually floats around 20% increase in density. So like if you're able to build like a 4-story building, now you'd be able to build a 5-story building. And that 5th story would have to be affordable. Like mixed within the building, it wouldn't just be like the penthouse is affordable, but you get the gist. And yeah, there'd be sort of some details around the average income, as well as how the former program would kind of be phased out because there's projects in the pipeline that are utilizing the former program. And like I said, this does not change mandatory inclusionary housing, which is what we really hope to see in this proposal. It's all about housing, right? And mandatory inclusionary housing, which requires any development on those designated areas to have a percentage of affordability. They're really not touching MIH. They're tweaking it a little bit, but we really wanted to see MIH go deeper, lower incomes, and more units per building, because right now we don't really we see it kind of as crumbs for the amount of bonus that a developer gets in exchange. And it's kind of our most powerful tool right now at getting at the affordability crisis. The next sort of topic area is infill development. As you might notice, around the city, there are these larger campus developments. We have, and maybe like locally, you'd be familiar with the Seward Park co-ops or the East River co-ops. Those are like larger campus development sites. And obviously a lot of NYCHA campuses, a lot of public housing is also campus style, like these large properties with tower in the park style development. There's a lot of technical language here, but the essence of it is they're going to basically unlock a lot more infill opportunities to build in between the buildings that are currently in existence. The only reason that they can't do it now is because of open space requirements, but they're kind of reeling those back in ways where now you're going to be able to see, you're going to like legally be able to build buildings in between some of these buildings where you couldn't do it now. It's really hard to say where it's like, each site is so specific, it's hard to predict exactly where these new infill developments are going to go. But that's generally the gist, is there's going to be more development potential on these large campuses. The this is kind of alarming because it's maybe the most impactful different it's the biggest difference that you can actually recognize, like from the street or living in that complex, versus like an extra floor. It's going to be like a whole new building. So it's a big change, we think. And what's also concerning is that there's really no requirements for affordability in this new development potential. Oftentimes, as I've already kind of discussed, you get these trade-offs in zoning where you say, oh, you can do this, but it has to be this way and it has to benefit the public in this way. Like zoning is always just sort of a leverage point, and they're not really using it as a leverage point. They're just saying, here you go. Now you can just build more of whatever you want. And so we have a problem with that, because if we're going to give up this like open space, then we're going to give up that sort of development area. You'd want something in return. And the most obvious thing is affordable housing. And they're not really requiring any affordability for these conversions. And while it might be a little tricky in how you actually devise what that looks like, it's definitely possible. And the most obvious example is requiring affordability on NYCHA campuses, which is not currently a part of the zoning, but that's something that we're trying to advocate for through this, is actually ensuring that through zoning, whatever gets built on a NYCHA campus is 100% affordable at incomes reflective of the incomes that like currently live there. So, act truly affordable, not just saying it's affordable, but it's actually pretty expensive. A third topic in this proposal is more sort of, I just kind of grouped a couple things into more and smaller units. They're trying to unlock ability to include a couple more units in development sites than you can today. A big part of this is the dwelling unit factor, which essentially creates minimum unit size averaging per development. So like it's basically saying your average unit size has to be this number of square feet. They're more or less doing away with that entirely. There are still housing codes at the city and state levels that require housing to be of a certain size, right, through light and air requirements. It's not like you can all of a sudden just like rent a closet to someone. You have to have windows, light, and air. The room has to be of a certain size. You have to have certain amenities and facilities, obviously. But this is sort of reeling back some of these protections that we have in terms of living standards. And I think another concern about this is it's going to, you can predict it to basically pivot toward studios, micro apartments, single room occupancy units, and away from in new development and away from bigger family size units. And we all know that we still need newly constructed family sized units as much as we need any other kind of unit. And we want to make sure that those continue to be built. So that's another concern that we have here in doing away with the dwelling unit. And then residential conversion, this is pretty straightforward. They're just allowing many more buildings that are currently commercial to be converted into residential. And again, it's the same thing with infill. They're not really getting anything in return. They're just allowing it because I guess they believe that their return is the supply of housing. But we believe that we can go a lot farther than that. That if we're going to be giving all these sort of handouts and giveaways to developers, we should be getting something as significant in return. And again, this is like another leverage point for affordable housing. These buildings, like this isn't actually going to be increasing density, right? It's just going to be converting. I think it's targeting mostly like large office towers in like Midtown that currently are not allowed to convert to residential. And so if that becomes housing, we want to make sure that it's affordable because that could yield hundreds of units per building. It's already very dense. So that's kind of another piece that we're advocating for. And then, something that we haven't focused on as much because we're a pretty high dense district, but I just am throwing in there is some lower density changes. Basically the density of all low density neighborhoods, which you see in the outer boroughs, like more of like the single family zoning type neighborhoods. It's all being bumped up a little bit. When I say a little bit, it's like relatively large, but that's just because it's currently so low. Where you have like I would say in the Lower East Side, average FAR density, which measures density, is around like 7 or 8. It's like a multiple of their lot size. In these lower density districts, it's 1 or sometimes 0.5. So when they bump it up a little bit, it's really just going up to like 1.5. So I guess for people who live down here, that seems like a smaller change, but in some of those lower density districts, you can feel it more. But it's not like they're tacking on as much density as we have downtown. And they're also doing some transit-oriented density increases for developments near subway stations, things like that. And they're also doing away with required parking, so for future developments, because a lot of districts in the city still require a certain number of accessory parking spots, not just on-street parking, but parking on site, depending on how large your building is. We don't have that downtown, so it's not going to affect us as much, but they're basically doing away with the requirement. You can still do it if you'd like to, and you'd have to follow certain guidelines, but you just aren't mandated through zoning. And so just my final couple slides are just covering some topics here that I've kind of touched on already. Obviously, like, displacement is always a huge concern when it comes to these big zoning changes, because it changes the way that developers think and act on sites across the city. Anytime you add density, you add speculation, because it increases the potential to redevelop that site. If you have a building, like a tenement building, and you can't build a building, if you demolished it, but you couldn't build something much bigger than what was there before, there's very little incentive to demolish it, right? But if all of a sudden the zoning goes up so that if you demolished it, you could build something maybe 1.5 times as big, that might push the scale enough for that developer to say that, you know what, I'm going to do that. And so these are the kinds of things that are really hard to measure, but are super impactful, especially in like historic districts, special districts, or districts with a lot of that kind of historic culture and character, where maybe there hasn't been a lot of redevelopment because there's not a lot of incentive right now. But as things change in one direction, you realize that there's actually nothing really keeping developers from clearing and starting over, essentially. Also, like, the way that they measure affordability is kind of skewed. They don't really measure, the administration doesn't really measure how they're losing rent stabilized units, rent controlled units in these kind of redevelopment scenarios. So that's just a huge thing to flag too, is they'll only talk about the number of units built, but they're not really talking about the number of affordable units lost in that process. And I think that we consider, like I kind of mentioned, you think that you might have a lot of protections or that there's laws in place around zoning to protect from these kinds of things, but there's always loopholes and there's always ways around them. And we see that on a daily basis. These development companies, like, that's what they specialize in, and they pay people hundreds of thousands of dollars to find those loopholes and to make them bigger. So I think it's always worth fighting those sort of speculative developers at every front that you can. Special districts, which are in zoning, they're different from historic districts. An example is Little Italy. It's like the special Little Italy district. They're districts that are established in the zoning. They don't really establish them anymore as much. They're kind of not within the portfolio, or like the sort of tool belt or the method approach to zoning that we see today. But there are a lot that were established in sort of the mid and later 20th century. They have very specific requirements and very specific regulations to that district. And through these text amendments, they're kind of making them conform more and more with citywide guidelines. This just means that these kinds of neighborhoods, like Little Italy, can maybe see even greater impact on the way that they're developed in the future, because they actually had these protections keeping certain things at bay that are no longer in place. You know, that doesn't have to happen, right? They don't have to change the special districts the way that they're changing other areas, but they're choosing to because they want everything to kind of be more conforming and more sort of, I guess, homogeneous in the way that the zoning approaches each neighborhood. But they don't have to, right? These special districts could remain as they are while still passing this process. And that's the whole point of special districts, is that they kind of exist outside of the regular zoning guidelines. Obviously, landmarks are going to be impacted. One of the big changes is to do with specifically with landmarks. They're essentially expanding how landmarks can transfer their air rights. What that means is air rights are the right to develop. Like when I talk about a building envelope or a density that's allowed, that usually equates to a certain amount of built floor area or built square feet. And so if you build a building, if you have a site that could be 10,000 square feet, but you build a building that's actually just 5,000 square feet, then you technically have 5,000 square feet of quote unquote air rights that you could sell. They're very limited in how you can sell them. A regular lot can only sell them next to the adjacent lot. But a landmark can actually currently sell them to the adjacent lot or the lot across the street or the lot diagonally across the street. And the purpose of that is because when a landmark sells its air rights, it's doing two things. It's well, I guess three things. One, it's making the building across the street bigger. But the two other things it's doing is one, generating funding for the landmark, which is always really important. Obviously, we have a lot of landmarks that are kind of dilapidated and under-maintained because they don't have that funding. And two, you're removing the development potential and speculation on that site. Because once you sell them, you can't use them again. They're gone. They belong to that other site. And so, like I said, that redevelopment risk of if you could build bigger, you're going to build bigger, that kind of gets eliminated through this transfer. And so we see that as a positive thing, even though you're making a building nearby bigger, it's almost like oftentimes that trade-off is worth it because you're generating funding for the building. So oftentimes it's like millions and millions of dollars. And you're also making sure that no one's going to try to demolish that landmark in the future because they can build something bigger. So that's getting expanded essentially in the way that now you can do it across the street from any street that borders the block on which the landmark stands. So it's a little bit of an expansion, but I think it could help a lot of landmarks sell those air rights and generate that money. Plus, they did put in some safeguards to make sure that you can't do like a sort of chain sale across a bunch of different landmarks. You can only sell off of an individual landmark. It doesn't apply to buildings that are just in a historic district. And there's other guardrails to make sure that it doesn't get abused. So we are pretty supportive of that aspect of the proposal. But still, there is like this overarching redevelopment potential across the board that we're worried about or just concerned about. And it definitely impacts landmarks as well if they do get that extra density increase and face that redevelopment risk. And so, there are ways to actually do the opposite. You can contextually zone, which is what we try to propose in our district, or in downtown. We're a huge proponent of contextual zoning, which is when it's zoning with height limits. And so if you could actually rezone an area so that it fits the current built environment. So it's like the building's average 5 stories, you zone it so that they can only be 5 stories, so that you really just eliminate that demolition and redevelopment risk. And so that's kind of the flip side of how zoning could actually help these areas. And then finally, just some recommendations. We have, we're trying to cover a lot at once, but some of the big things, like I mentioned, are more affordability, more mandated affordability, especially on conversions and on IG campuses. Reining in some of these extra density increases across the board so that you're not creating so many of these soft sites, which are like these sites that could be redeveloped into bigger buildings. And also encouraging a mix of unit sizes, still prioritizing family units in certain instances. And also just considering, like we did in the last round, how all of this impacts general quality of life, habitability standards, and just the livability of the neighborhoods downtown, to make sure we're just not overdoing anything, even if it feels like a positive, so that it ends up turning into a negative. And so I guess to wrap, like the council member in our office have a ton of major concerns, I'd say, with this text amendment. We are eager to see these significant changes that we've been asking for, and I think without them, we're not gonna be supportive. There's no way for us to be supportive of this proposal. So we're still in the midst of those negotiations, but you know, our vote really hinges on some serious changes to get at some of these things that I brought up tonight. So I'll stop sharing.
Honor,
And yeah, sorry.
thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. That was really informative, very clear and information packed. So thank you. Thank you very much. Um, I want to open it up to some comments and discussion, but I want to start by saying, at LESPI, we have, some real concerns. A lot of them are shared with the same concerns that you guys have at your office, Connor. But kind of the broadest big picture concern is this kind of blanket rezonings where the city just comes along and says everything's being upzoned. It doesn't matter whether the subway stations are so packed that people can't even, get onto the platforms, or they're getting squeezed into the tracks, or sidewalks where people are spilling over into traffic, or where you have, just endless pressure for redevelopment, as you said, where tenants are getting harassed constantly by landlords to push them out and build bigger buildings. There are so many downsides here, and it's not as if we feel that there's no place in the city, including in Lower Manhattan, that could stand some extra density. But we feel like that the blanket approach, doesn't look at it from a surgical perspective. What's the best for this community? How do we squeeze this in here? Over here, we've got transit that can hold a lot more people. That kind of thing is just a matter of taking a broad brush. And my understanding is it's done that way because it's easier politically. That otherwise, different neighborhoods and different elected officials are going to be arguing with each other, like, well, why does this neighborhood get saved from this and our neighborhood gets hit? But to me, that doesn't seem like a very good rationale for urban planning, which really should be smart growth that's sympathetic to the community. So, what is your office's thinking about that?
yeah. I mean, I think we agree that it's a massive proposal with massive consequences. Um, and obviously the materials that they're going to be putting out are all going to be in sort of support of the positive consequences, I guess, as they see them, of the proposal. But that's kind of part of what we're trying to accomplish, is trying to take less of a biased, or at least biased in that perspective, um, sort of presentation of what's actually in front of us. That's kind of the first step, because we just want to make sure that people actually understand what's happening. And then anyone is entitled to come up with a decision on their own. But it's so large and it's so technical that sort of maybe like the most baseline problem is that it's kind of going right under people's noses, and people aren't even actually aware at any level, like even in the council, of what exactly is happening. So I think that its sheer scale and impact is almost like, in my opinion, irresponsible. And I don't think that ULERP was meant to take on like an application of this scale, or these three applications of this scale back to back in a year. Um, I think it's, like you mentioned, it's definitely political strategy to try to push as much through as possible under one term, because this is supposed to be an Adams plan. This is like they're trying to get all this done in one administration. And with that, you're sacrificing the actual engagement and ability for people to really opine and digest what's in front of them. And so I think that, even past administrations haven't overhauled the zoning to this extent. And I don't think that they should. I think that, this could have been broken up into 100 applications, but they decided to pack it all into 3 and just push them through one at a time. And yeah, I think it's a bit irresponsible from that perspective.
Well, we
So I
have
think
for,
yeah, there's sort of like a fundamental issue there.
thanks. We have time for a few questions or comments if people want to raise their hand. Otherwise, we're ready to talk about the Church of St. Mary on Grand Street. Any takers? I know that there was a lot if you're not familiar with City of Yes, there's a lot of information to digest there. But we're recording this and it will be put on our website so that if people want to go back and refer to it, they certainly can. Not on our website, I'm sorry, on our YouTube channel, which you can get to through our website. And also on our website is LESPI's list of objections to the City of Yes housing opportunity proposal. We have maybe 7 or 8 specific objections, but some of the stuff that we like. And so it's not, it's not all bad as Conor said. So Helena, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Connor. So, in addition to the any objections and comments that LESPI might have, I live here on Grand Street in the midst of all of the NYCHA housing. And I'm really quite horrified at the idea of infill. These buildings were, and these housing projects were built specifically with space in between them so that people have air and light and some greenery. And I think the people who are living in NYCHA housing are already facing tough enough conditions without having to put another building in their midst, which will cut off light and all of their recreation capacity. So I find to be horrifying, and I would object to any building any infill building in NYCHA complexes.
No, I think that's an important point that I think with those kind of tower in the park style developments, the open space is just as much a part of the design as the buildings themselves. And so the buildings are, yeah, like you mentioned, the buildings are designed with the open space in mind. And the only reason it really works is because they have that open space. And so I think that instead of, yeah, it's sort of like, I guess, obviously there's tiers of density in the city, right? And you could, in theory, make a site more dense, and then you would allow for more development. But they're almost like taking this sort of backdoor approach. And instead of actually just saying, you know what, we're upzoning this NYCHA campus, they're saying, no, actually now they can just, it's the same zoning, but now suddenly they can build a lot more. And I just think that zoning actually has a lot of flexibility built in. And that's sort of what these changes in these processes are supposed to be for, but not this sort of kind of opaque and a little bit misleading approach to trying to sort of trick everyone into allowing everything to be developed as of right all of a sudden. They could a lot of these things can happen today through different processes, but they're trying to sort of knock all of that out at once. So you don't even have to go to anybody to do it in the future. That's kind of the problem with these text amendments is it's citywide. And basically anything moving forward isn't going to have to go to the council or the planning commission for these things that they're now allowing just from the jump. Yeah, so I think that's a huge concern as well.
Ellen has her hand raised.
Hi. What is the status of this right now? Are other council members also having a lot of issues with it? And is there a vote scheduled, or how does it work?
Yeah, so so like I mentioned, it's at the City Planning Commission right now. The vote is, they haven't actually scheduled it yet, but I believe it's going to happen toward the end of the month, maybe in early October. And then once they do, so they'll have their vote. They might make some changes at their stage, but it's probably not going to be very significant. And then it gets sent to the council. First, it goes to the subcommittee on zoning and franchises, and then it'll go to the committee on land use. And then it finally goes to the full council for a full council vote. And that's kind of the final step and the most, the one with the most eyes on it. There is a ton of opposition currently, especially in the outer boroughs, because people really do not want to add density to their neighborhoods in some of those lower density areas. In the way that we have a lot of problems here, I think that it's almost just a flat out no in much of like South Brooklyn and outer Queens, places like in Staten Island. And so they have a lot of work to do in those areas and trying to like address some of those concerns. The vote, I think the council vote would most likely happen in the fall or early winter. But again, it's kind of up in the air. There's no actual timeline for this kind of application. So it's probably going to drag out longer than most just because of how much controversy there is. Because they're not going to put it up. Usually how it works is they're not going to put it up to a vote unless they know it's going to pass. Right? Because the last thing they want is to let the council vote on it and have them vote it down. Because then they have to start all over again. And it's a terrible look. So, you know, that all is a bit up in the air and could drag out for a bit. I will say that with each council hearing and each council stage, they have the opportunity for a hearing and usually for public testimony. It's all live streamed and available. You can go to City Hall and testify. So I think that's kind of also the final piece here is we, even if this isn't like your forte, I think because it's so widely impactful, we encourage everyone to get it as involved as they can. I think that the testimony and the community sort of opinion does actually matter, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And it often helps our office because then it doesn't just sound like it's coming from us. We can point to the frustrations in the communities that we represent. And so we definitely do encourage people to get involved and to find ways to testify and always reach out to our office if you have questions or want to talk about any of it more.
Well, I don't see any further questions. I think this is a good time to move to the Church of St. Mary on Grand Street. But Conor, thank you. And you're going to stick around to talk about St. Mary also? Great, because
Yeah, I'd stick around.
Councilmember Marte's office has been you know, very involved in that as well. So Deborah Wye, one of our LESPI Vice Presidents, is going to give a brief presentation now on the church, and then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps to trying to protect the church and make sure that it doesn't get demolished like so many other of our religious structures, historic religious structures have been demolished around the city.
So I'll share my screen.
Please.
Yeah. Okay, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
Yes, you're
Yes, we can
fine.
hear you,
You're
Deborah.
fine.
Okay,
Deborah.
okay, all right. The Church of St. Mary has long been a cultural and architectural beacon on Grand Street. It is also the oldest Catholic church in New York. St. Patrick's on Mott Street is older, but it was built as a cathedral for the diocese. St. Mary's also represents fundamental aspects of the history of New York. It was founded during the early years of Catholicism here, a religion which was once forbidden, but would eventually be practiced by more adherents than any other. In addition, it recalls the first waves of immigration, a phenomenon especially important for the Lower East Side. The congregation was founded nearly 200 years ago in 1826. Its bicentennial will be celebrated in 2 years. It began in order to serve the needs of Irish Catholic immigrants who were flocking to the neighborhood for jobs on the East River waterfront. But there was much anti-Catholic sentiment in New York at that time, which we will see is also part of St. Mary's history. The first St. Mary's Church was on nearby Sheriff Street in a building of a former Protestant congregation. That building caught fire on November 9th, 1831, just 5 years after St. Mary's was founded. This is a newspaper account published 3 days later. It reports that the fire was premeditated and set in 3 different places. Also, the church bell had been tied down so fire companies could not be alerted. This was an example of what happened in an atmosphere of rampant anti-Catholic feelings, which were, at that time, coming from both nativists and also Irish Protestants. One of the greatest fears was the Catholic dependence on the Pope. But this short article ends with a fundraising plea to build a new church. That effort was successful, and the new church opened just 2 years later at the present Grand Street location. This is how the church looked at that time. It was built in the Greek Revival style that was very popular. Later, the facade and its columns would be removed for an updated front in 1864. The fieldstone side walls, so you get my cursor here, right here, and the tall elongated windows would remain, and they are seen in the church today. This is the new front, designed by an Irish Catholic immigrant architect, Patrick Keeley. Keeley was the most prolific designer of Catholic churches at a time when Catholicism was spreading rapidly and the need for new parish churches was great. The building remains much the same today, 160 years later, although the neighborhood around it has been transformed. On the right is a view of a plaque in the entry vestibule of the church, right up here. That was on the original facade of the church I showed you earlier, and it does have the date in Roman numerals of, let's see, try to get the cursor. Oh, here it is. Right here in Roman numerals, it says 1833. So you see that when you enter the church. St. Mary's has borne witness to all the many changes in the neighborhood over the years. This is a view of the church from Ridge Street in 1924. That section of the street is no longer there. In its place is a small playground with amphitheater seating. This is a view looking east along Grand Street. You can see how the church was once crowded in among the tenements. The area to the left of the church, right here, is now a parking lot. And right over here, a little further west, is where Attorney Street was. And the rectory, the present rectory, is now down a path that was once Attorney Street. Here's a view from the 1970s, after the urban renewal developments that began in the 1960s. The 2 tall towers are part of the Grand Street Guild, which was a venture initiated by St. Mary's to build affordable housing in partnership with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There is a 3rd tower on Broome Street from the 1970s, and a new 4th building is about to open. The pastor at that time is quoted as saying that this affordable housing would be for, quote, all faiths, people of all faiths or no faiths. At the right is a group of young residents of the Grand Street Guild buildings sitting on the steps of St. Mary's Rectory in the 1970s. I now want to turn to some of the architectural features of the building. Here you see the detailing under the cornice of one of the towers. Again, right here. As well as 2 different window designs. Each of the windows has a distinctive brownstone trim, which in architectural terminology is known as a Gibbs surround, after an early British architect named James Gibbs. You can see stained glass details in the small window on the left and a distinctive wood double arch design of the building on the right, of the window on the right. This double arch design is found on many of the church windows. It is a window type often seen on Gothic style churches, but actually derives from the earlier Romanesque period. You find the same brownstone trim around the doors. It is actually the signature design motif of the church. This is the central entrance doorway. Above it are stained glass elements, including an M at the center for St. Mary. You see right here. Again, I want to point to the fieldstone side walls, which are the oldest structural elements of the church. This is the west side of the church, and this is the east side. You see that the stained glass windows also have that double arched design that I mentioned earlier. You see that here. The lower level, here on the west side and here on the east side, is the church basement. As the church was being erected in 1833, services were held down there until the upper church was completed. The area is now an event space for the church. Here's a wonderful view of the stained glass windows from inside the church. With its warm red brick and its rich brownstone trim, as well as its prominent location on Grand Street, St. Mary's communicates a sense of welcoming for the neighborhood as a place of community. With its fieldstone side walls, it also reflects layers of history. LESPI believes that this singular building deserves recognition as a New York City designated landmark, which would protect it for future generations. And we join so many people from the area who have signed petitions to save it. Today, St. Mary's is a multi-ethnic parish dominated by a Latino population. Its very well-attended masses are celebrated in Spanish and in English. Landmark status would be an especially meaningful way to acknowledge the congregation's upcoming bicentennial. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That was wonderful, as usual, I should say. Does anybody have any questions? And then we're gonna have a little bit of a discussion, informal discussion about what steps are being taken to get the building landmarked. And Councilmember Marte's office has been leading the charge, along with one of the community leaders, Norma Ramirez. And so Conor and Norma, maybe you guys could speak a little bit about next steps for trying to build a critical mass of support for landmarking.
Oops. Is Norma on?
I didn't. Is she? You see Norma?
Norma is she was on. We might have lost her.
I mean, I can quickly just say that yeah, like our office is definitely super supportive of this effort, and I think similar to kind of what I was talking about before, we this is kind of part of the effort to kind of combat some of that displacement and some of that speculation. And the council member also growing up in this area is very fond and of the church and knows it well. And I think like Deborah mentioned, and that was a great presentation. I learned a lot also in that presentation of things I didn't know. But I think it is true, like it is such a well-used space now still after all these years. And it does really speak to like the waves of different populations that have come through the area. It's like, you never know if you hop around from sort of decade to decade who might be occupying the church or the congregation or the neighborhood, but it's always going to be sort of full of life and very well used and very important to a lot of people. So I think that it really is testament to that history. And so, yeah, we want to do whatever we can to help support its saving.
We have a question from Marianne. If the church is threatened, and I think this would be a great time for Ann Friedman to chime in. She's has so much experience with historic sacred sites, not only in the city but around the state. But I think probably more in the city than anybody. And you know, maybe you could speak about short-term and long-term, you know, potential threats or non-threats.
Sure. You know, I think the alarm was raised by some notifications that were put up.
You're kind of breaking
in the
up a little
church.
bit. You're breaking up a
And
little bit.
there was a popular longtime okay. Maybe I'll turn off my video and speak.
Maybe that, yeah, that's better.
There was a very popular longtime priest who was removed. Okay. Who was removed and replaced with an administrator. And that's always an alarm sign for Catholic churches because it represents often consolidation of parishes and downgrading of some of the you know, churches within a yoked parish. You know, it's also just concerning because it's a high-rise block. They're tower housing all around, and the church has protection, so it's of concern. Marianne, who asked the question, works for the research department of the Landmarks Commission, so I think, you know, Marianne can also speak to the process of review. You know, Deborah's done a great job of preparing and submitting a request for evaluation. So at this point, LESPI is waiting to hear back from LPC in response to the submission. The concern submitted a letter of support, and I'm sure that LESPI is securing letters of support for their organizations and certainly from the council member's office, which is very important. The commission can't really push through a designate if a council member. That's really important that you have that support. Realistically, there have been very few designations, individual designations. There have been very few designations of any kind, as village preservation has made us aware in the last month or so through their research. You know, this administration is designating fewer landmarks than any administration in recent history. The last individual designations of Catholic churches were important, were designed by Renwick or Renwick successor firms. There were 2 churches in Harlem and one in Turtle Bay. And those were recognized as architecturally, historically significant because they were designed by the architect of St. Patrick's Cathedral. So this church, you know, which the original church was, you know, a handsome Greek Revival building, but vernacular. Patrick Keeley was tremendously prolific, but none of his buildings, none of his churches in New York City have been individually designated. So, you know, in our support letter, we tried to turn that into a positive and say Keeley was so prolific and so important to Catholic Church history, the East Coast, that, you know, his work really warrants designation. So, you know, I think you're making a very strong argument, but I really, you know, I'm not in a good position to predict how the Landmarks Commission is going to respond. You know, the diocese has said within the last year that they have no imminent plans to close or redevelop the church. But there are churches closing and being redeveloped all the time. The Archdiocese has closed and sold 2 churches in Yorkville and East Harlem in the last year, and are actively looking for more development opportunities and more consolidation. So, all many historic religious properties that don't have landmark protection are at risk. And landmark protection only protects the building, it doesn't protect the use. So this building could still be closed and sold, but if it were designated, then it could not be demolished. So.
Bill, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Deborah, for this. One of my roles when at the Landmarks Commission many years ago was being the liaison to religious property. So I got all over New York to see every type of church. And there definitely is a history on the Lower East Side of buildings not only changing congregations, but also being, modified to some degree. Thinking of, I guess, is it the former Mariners or First Baptist Church, among others. But nothing quite so dramatic as this. Maybe just talk a little bit, and we could also loop in my dear colleague, Marianne Hurley. What do you think sort of drove such a dramatic stylistic change? Was it, in response to a broader sort of fashion, or the church's, interest in kind of repositioning itself? This reminds me a little bit of St. Monica's in Queens that had the Rundbogenstiel, but kind of also a distinctive style, kind of unlike something you typically associated with Catholic churches.
Yeah, I think it's the definitely the evolution of the style, because those early Greek revivals, became unfashionable within 20 or 30 years. So, and this was more European also in its aesthetic. And but I do want to comment too about the Keeley, that Anne had mentioned, that there are no individual landmarks by Keeley. And yet he was one of the most important. He was the important Roman Catholic architect, and not just New York City. I mean, he designed the cathedral in Chicago and all over. I mean, he was an amazing powerhouse of church architecture. And his son-in-law then took over after he retired. So it's amazing that he's not better represented in the New York, landmarks, for sure.
Sandra, you have your hand up. I'm gonna see. I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, I had to navigate. First, hi everyone. First, let me say, although I'm the chair of landmarks for CB3, I'm here in my capacity, not representing CB3, but Grand Street Guild residents. As you know, I am the president here. I'm also a resident, a lifelong resident. I'm actually born on the block 60 years ago. So the church has been with me my whole life, and is very, very important to the residents here, as well as the rest of the community. But the alarm, actually, we got alerted a couple of years ago when we heard a rumor that they wanted to build on the parking lot. And so that spawned everything. And I wound up reaching out to Borough President Mark Levine, and he assured me that there was no development pending there. I also talked to the Catholic Church, some of the, I think the previous priest, we have a new priest now, but they basically guaranteed that, or try to assure that there's no plans for development or destruction or, of the church. But like everyone has said, the best way to be protected is to have it landmarked. That's the greatest assurance, but also I know too, that it is not common practice for the Catholic Church to landmark any of their churches. So I know it's a hard fight. It'll be a hard battle to get them to do this. I'm not sure why. I think, let me say, that they may make an exception because of the long history of this church. I know that other properties they might want to develop on at some time, but I think we have a good argument for it, but it'll probably be a long battle in order to get it done. Thank you.
I can just also say quickly, in response to someone put in the chat about what we can do to help. So obviously, yeah, like people have mentioned, it's kind of unclear where we lie in terms of how much the commission is going to support the designation. But we're trying to give it our best shot, and is also sort of one piece of the puzzle. Like has also been mentioned, it doesn't prevent change of use or sale. Obviously, it does a great deal to prevent potential buyers, right? Because they'll probably, like a lot of people would buy with redevelopment in mind. But like with any sort of displacement risk in the neighborhood, sort of takes efforts on all angles, and I think a lot of it is we can't know until it hits us. But for the time being, we're really trying to focus in on its designation as a landmark. We're planning a demonstration by the end of the month. Some of the details have to be finalized still, but we're planning a demonstration just to show support for the church and for its preservation. So please just keep in the lookout for that. I'm sure we've been working with LESPI and with Norma and the other congregation members to try to show the turnout of support for the church from the whole neighborhood, not in a way that's super antagonistic or anything like that, but just really just try to show the positive support for the church's protection. So if that's a great way to get involved. So just be on the lookout for that. And I think, just as things come, there'll be more opportunities to demonstrate support. There was a petition also for its landmarking that went around for a few weeks earlier this summer. That kind of wrapped up. We were able to get several thousand signatures, which was great. And we also spoke to that in the RFE. But yeah, I think just more keeping in the loop. LESPI is definitely in the loop, as you can tell, on this effort. So if you're subscribed to their messages or our messages, I'm sure it'll come up again.
And if you're not subscribed to our mailing list, you can do that on our website, www.lespi-nyc.org. That's lespi-nyc.org, and you can sign up for our email list. We don't send out a lot of emails, so we won't deluge your inbox. But we do have some important LES type news and notifications that you might be interested in. So Sandra, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to add, I hope I didn't sound too negative, but you have to know that the residents here are in 100% support. We contributed to I contributed to the petitions, and I got like at least 200 signatures. So,
Nice.
whatever help you need, we can, work together. I'm, willing to work together.
And then, of course, it'll go through the community board, landmarks committee, and then through the full board, when it moves a little further along the line, as far as the commission is concerned. Michelle? You're muted.
Hi, yes, I'm not anymore. Hi. Okay, I just wanted to add that I was in speaking with the Chinatown Lower East Side staff coalition, and this church is very important to them for the community, that that the work that is done there and the members of the community that meet there and as a community institution. And so I know it's very important to them. I don't know if there's anybody here from that group right now, but I think that's one institution to reach out to. I think, Richard, they had spoken with you about this and their activities there.
Mm,
Yeah, that's that's the we've been in talks with them too. Yeah,
yeah, I think
they're
it's
in the
really
loop on it.
Connor
And,
directly. Yes, you mean Suzanne's group?
yeah, like the Chinese Staff Workers Association folks. Like,
Yeah.
they've been helpful too in rallying people, and they see the importance in the fight too. So,
Right.
we're just continuing, the kind of, they're like an example of folks who are also supportive.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I think there's one other raised hand I'm kind of looking for right now. It disappeared. Are there any last questions? We ran a little over here, kind of our target time, but I think we've had some great information, and it's nice to see a lot of concerned New Yorkers here, both for the Lower East Side and for the Church of St. Mary, particularly. And then Helena, you were going to make a couple of announcements. Helena is also a fellow LESPI board member.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much, Connor and Deborah. Those were great. And as you can see from our presentation tonight, LESPI has great programs, and we have another one coming up that I want to announce, and that will be a photography exhibit that will be based on the photos from the 3 Lens on the Lower East Side books that LESPI has published. And this will be a display of selected photographs, and we'll also have a panel discussion with some of our photographers and with one of our writers. And those discussions tend to be very lively and fun. And so I hope that you'll be able to join us. That will be at the Ottendorfer Library, which is on 2nd Avenue and 8th Street, and it will open in mid-November. So just look for the notifications for that. If LESPI's preservation efforts are of interest to you and you'd like to volunteer with us, we would love to have you volunteer with us. And of course, we would love to have you join as a member. Our membership fees are very reasonable. It's only $20 a year. Or if you would like to donate less than that, we'll be happy to have any donation that you're willing to offer us. And with that, I look forward to seeing you at the Ottendorfer Library. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank Deborah and Connor and everybody else who contributed tonight. It was a great event, I think, and hopefully we'll have some good coming out of it. And we have to keep marching forward and trying to make sure that the important and wonderful aspects of our neighborhood are preserved and protected. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.